Hey everybody, this is Neil. Welcome back to another boot camp tutorial. Today I'm going to jump right into the action. No housekeeping or anything. We're going to talk about bypass movement. So what is bypass movement? It's basically the ability for units. In this case, I'm going to be focusing purely on infantry units. Later, much later, we'll talk about vehicle bypass movement. But for this case, infantry movement gives you the ability to move your infantry around obstacles. And it's a mechanic that is not present in starter kit, and I wish it were. I played a bunch of starter kit last year, and it was a mechanic I sorely missed because it transforms, in my opinion, it transforms the battlefield and makes it much more dynamic and makes for better tactical options and tactical decisions that can be made. And I'll show that in the example. If you want to jump to the example now, you can just use the chapter feature or the timestamp links in the description below, right down there. And you can jump straight to the example. And I'm going to show how bypass movement can transform traditional movement, which I covered in infantry movement tutorial, which is what starter kit uses, um, can be transformed using bypass movement. But first, we need to jump into the mechanics of bypass. How does it actually work? Okay. So let me give me a dry erase marker so I can start jotting down things. So the mechanics of bypass movement, um, you can bypass obstacles, as I mentioned before, but only specific obstacles. So we're talking infantry bypass today. And you can only bypass buildings and woods. So buildings and woods. You can't bypass anything else in the game. You can't bypass water features. You can't bypass inherent terrain like grain or orchards. You can't bypass streams. You can't bypass hill crest lines, which aren't shown on the map I'm using right now. The only thing you can bypass are buildings and woods. Everything else you have to pay the movement factors or movement points for vehicles for those terrain features. So let's get into the specifics of how you use bypass in for a building or woods. I'm not going to show both because they're exactly the same. They're interchangeable whether you're bypassing a buildings or a woods hex. Now, before you do bypass, you have to announce it. You can't have a unit sitting here and you start moving through a hex and you bypass it as you're moving. You have to say, you're in this hex, you're gonna say, I'm gonna bypass the obstacle in hex AA7 in this case. And then you move in to the hex. Now, after it's announced, you have to decide whether you're going to bypass one or two hex sides of that hex. Now let me get the counter out of the way here. So normally you can bypass one or two hex sides. One or two hex sides. You can bypass more than that, but it really doesn't make sense, but only in a very specific situation. So let's say our squad is here that we just had, and we're going to bypass this building here in AA7. Now you can bypass one hex side. I'm gonna bypass this side of the building as the example. You can bypass one hex side by going this direction to that hex, to AA6, or you can bypass two hex sides and go to Z6. That's the meaning of bypassing one hex side or two hex sides. And when you do that, when you announce you're bypassing one or two hex sides, whether you're going around this side or this side. It's the same as far as cost. You pay the movement factor of the terrain in the hex other than the obstacle you're bypassing. 95% of the time, maybe even higher than that, it's going to be open ground. There's very few cases where there's a building sitting in a grain, right in the middle of a grain, or right in the middle of a woods, or a woods sitting in the middle of a grain. It's always a woods and a building sitting on open ground. So the vast majority of the time, you're going to be paying cost of terrain, which is going to be 1 instead of 2 for entering the building. But that's only if you bypass 1 or 2 hex sides. Okay. If you choose to bypass 3 hex sides, you have to pay double the cost of the terrain outside the obstacle. So you could bypass 3 hex sides and go to here. That would cost you 2 movement factors. Double open ground is 2. So 1 times 2, obviously. Now, why would you do this? You could just announce that you were going to bypass the other side, draw a different color, and just go this way and spend 1, because you're bypassing your normally allotted 1 or 2 hex sides. That would only cost you 1 movement point, while this way would cost you 2 if you bypass 3 hex sides. Now, there may be rare situations where you choose to go way around the backside to avoid line of sight for units maybe down here that have the opportunity to fire at you, as opposed to running in front of the building. There may be situations where all 3 of these vertices are blocked and no one can fire at you than if you would have run in front of the building and do a bypass that way. It's not very often that's going to come up. Most of the time, instead of going all the way around the building and expending the double cost of terrain, you'll just go in front of the building in the red here and expend the 1 extra movement for the open ground. Okay. Now, you cannot, as you're bypassing, you cannot voluntarily stop in the hex in bypass. There are situations where you can end up being there during bypass, but you can't voluntarily stop. The only time you can voluntarily stop is if you have enough movement factors to also move into the obstacle. So in this case, if I had this leader here and he was going to bypass on this black portion and spend 1, and then he suddenly decided, I'm going to stop here, he would have to expend 2 more to get into the building. If he didn't have those, that would be an illegal move, and he'd have to move back, and he'd have to start over here. Now, if you're moving through, you're bypassing on the black side here again, and you happen to be fired on by a unit, and say these units fire at him in bypass, and I'll go over those mechanics shortly, and you happen to break in that hex, you can stay in that hex, and you're broken outside the building until the end of the movement phase, and you're still subject to fire during the movement phase by other units until the end of the movement phase, when you are considered to be inside the building. Same as if you're moving through and you got fired on and you end up getting pinned. You are pinned outside the building in bypass, still subject to fire, possible fire from other units. And then at the end, you're pinned inside the building at the end of your movement phase. Those are the only 2 cases where you can stop in bypass involuntarily. Voluntarily, you cannot stop unless you have movement factors to move inside that building, inside the hex. Let's see. Now, the line of sight. Yeah, I just brought that up. I'm just going to erase this. I'll just keep using this hex as an example, and I'll use this leader here. Say the leader is, again, moving through this hex. This is purely hypothetical. This is probably, it isn't a move that I would do because there's units all over. But let's say he's moving and he's bypassing like that, and he's going to here for whatever reason. As he's in bypass, he is still in the obstacle hex, but he's not inside the obstacle. In other words, he's not actually on the hex side. He's basically in between the building and the hedge in this case, and he can be fired on. Now, the person doing defensive first fire during the movement phase has two options. Let's say this unit with the light machine gun decides to fire at that 80 leader. He has two options to decide. He can trace a line of sight to one of the vertices along the hex sides that he's bypassing that are referenced during the bypass, or he can trace a line of sight to the center dot. Now, in both cases, he needs to have a line of sight. So, in this case, I'm just going to approximate the line of sight to there. Looks like that would be clear. That may be blocked. So he could shoot at these two vertices. He could take a shot at those two vertices. And normal first fire movement in the open and first fire non-assault movement would apply. In this case, moving in the open wouldn't apply because he has a protection of the hedge. But if that hedge wasn't there, this fire would get both non-assault movement -1 and moving it in the open -1 as well. Now the other option is the firer can, and this has to be announced before you take the shot. So if there's a line of sight check required, you check the line of sight that you're using. The other option is you shoot to the center of the, oops, that is a terrible line of sight draw. He shoots to the center of the hex being bypassed. Those are the two options. Line of sight to the vertices being bypassed, or to the center of the hex being bypassed. Now, the only time a line of sight is considered clear is if, one, there's no obstacle blocking it, and two, did I say two first? One, if there's no obstacle blocking it, and two, if the line of sight traced to the center crosses one of the hex sides being bypassed. In this case, it's true. Now, if there was a unit, let's say there was a unit here, and this leader is bypassing the back side of this house. Let's put him here. Yeah, let's put him there. As excuse me, as a leader bypassing, it looks like he has a line of sight to this vertex, and that would be a legal shot. But if he chose, he wouldn't in this case, but if he chose the center line of hex, the center dot for the line of sight, he would not be able to, he wouldn't have a line of sight because the line of sight does not cross one of the hex sides being bypassed, which is on the back side. If he was bypassing on the front side, this unit would have a lot of options. He could fire at this vertex, or the center. Okay. So, in summary, line of sight for firing units on a unit bypassing a hex has to be traced to either one of the vertices being traversed or to the center. And if it goes to the center, it must cross through a hex side being bypassed. So for if you're bypassing one hex side, that's equal 2 vertices. And if you're bypassing 2 hex sides, you have 3 vertices as an option for line of sight. One hex side, if the leader was going to there instead, the 2 hex sides would be, 2 vertices would be here and here. If he's bypassing 2 hex sides, that extra vertice. Hopefully that makes sense. And I really wish they would have added bypass. It's not a very hard mechanic, but I really wish they would have added it to starter kit because it opens up a whole new world of movement and fire in this case. Now hindrances obviously apply. So if there was wheat here and this unit fired at the leader bypassing and he fired at this vertex, he would have a hindrance for the grain, plus he'd have a +1 tem for the hedge. Both of those, either of those would negate the moving in the open, but there'd still be non-assault movement, so there'd be a 1 hindrance, and then a +1 for the hedge underneath there, and a -1 for non-assault movement, so it would be a +1 shot from these units for this leader in bypass. If this unit tried to fire at him bypassing on the backside, back here, it would be blocked at a vertice. It would be blocked by the building. Would not be blocked in this vertice, but these two vertices, maybe it might be clear to that one. But it would definitely be blocked if you fired at this vertice here. You would not be able to make that shot. So the intricacies of line of sight are a lot more options involved because the line of sight is moving to either a vertex or to the center dot, and depending on how you choose to move your unit, whether it's around a building or woods, this direction or this direction, is going to dictate how the shot goes in, or the units surrounding that hex. It's going to dictate how you choose to move around that building if you choose not to go in it. That's it for bypass. It's not really that hard, but I'm going to show you here. Let me clean this up. I think I had him here. I kind of set up a hypothetical example, which we're going to jump into now, showing a traditional move situation for some units versus what you might do with bypass movement and how that affects the dynamic of your tactics and how things play out on the battlefield. Okay, so let's say we've got these. Let me get a different pen. Let's do this one here. We have these 3 units: squad here, squad here, squad here. Leader really isn't going to be involved. I'm going to move him aside in case I need him. And they want to move to, for whatever reasons, they want to move to this hex, this hex. Hopefully that's showing up, and this hex. For whatever reasons, they want to get there. Okay, let's call these units. Let's call this objective 1. Unit 1. Objective 2. Unit 2. And objective 3. Unit 3. Let's start with 1. And we're going to do traditional movement first. Let's call it traditional, or I'm calling it SK style of movement. I'm going to try to mark this in red or pink. And then we're going to do bypass with a bypass option. I'm going to try to mark those in blue. Hopefully it doesn't get too confusing. So let's start with a traditional here. Start with unit 1. Now you don't have many options here. Let's just count out some different options. So use my tweezers so I don't mark it up. Say he goes to here. He wants to go to objective 1. 1 to get over the wall, 2 to get into open ground. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh crap, he can't get there even if he double times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's go 1, 2. I'm not even checking for enemy line of sight. I'm just seeing how much it takes to get there. 1, 2, 3. Orchard is 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 again. Well, crap, huh? The closest I can get is 1 hex. Even if I double time, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He'd have to double time. That's as far as he could get. He guess he could go to 6, but that's not really gaining him much. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, let's just double time this guy, and he'll take a relatively safe route. I don't think anything can see him if he goes this way. So 1, 2, 1 over the wall, 2 for open ground, 3, 4. Let's go to 5. But he's going to be CX. Okay. So he's going to go like that. So that's going to cost him 2, 3, 4, 5 to go there. That's the traditional way. I'm just going to leave the CX counter there. Let's put him back. Now, what if he bypassed? How could he get there? Let's see. Bypassing isn't going to help us going over walls or anything. So let's go this way. Let's go 1, 2, bypass this, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, look at that. He can get there. So let's go 1, 2, bypass this side, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. Now he makes it there. He made it to his objective building, and he's not counter exhausted from double timing. I'm sorry, he did have to double time, but he made it there. My mistake. So double time, but he did make it to his objective. So that's the difference of what bypass can get you in a tactical situation. You might be able to reach the objective that your unit needs to reach by using double time. Now let's take a look at Unit 2. I marked that in the wrong color. You know what I meant. That should be blue. That's the bypass route. Okay, sorry about that. So let's look at Unit 2 here. He wants to get to Objective 2. Now, in this case, he might encounter some fire, but he's going to go, let's see, he could go, this guy might have a line of sight. I think I checked that ahead of time, and it just clips this corner right here. But let's assume this unit does have a long range line of sight to this hex. I could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'd have to double time again. Let's assume that it is blocked and he goes here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Crap, he'd have to double time again. Okay. So let's just assume it's blocked. Assume this line of sight just clips this corner to this center here. So he'll go 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. But he could take fire in this hex from this leader and squad and medium machine gun. Like that. And that would be a 8. You can't include, you can either take the terrain effect modifier of the building or the head. You cannot combine them. Obviously, the building is more, so that's a +2. But he's using non-assault movement. So -1 non-assault movement, -1 for leader, so -2, and then a +2 building. It would be even. That would be an 8 -0, or 8 even shot from here. If they fired at that, assuming they didn't use bypass movement. Okay. and that would cost them, or that squad, that would be 1, 3, 5, and they would be counter exhausted. I need another counter exhausted. Come on. No, I have one here somewhere. There we go. He would be counter exhausted to get there. Now let's do bypass. How could he get there using bypass and not being fired on? That would be a bonus. Or not giving this unit the opportunity to fire. So he would start here again. He could go 1, bypass this backside 2, 3, 4. So that'd be 1, bypass 2, 4. Now in this case, this squad, heavy machine gun leader, could not fire on him in this hex because they do not have a line of sight to these backside vertices, especially this one here, which is blocked. Okay. They could still fire on this building when they entered it here at the end, but the unit is no longer counter exhausted. They made it there. They might still take fire, but they would not be counter exhausted. They would not have to double time. Now let's take a look at Unit 3 here, trying to get to Objective 3 using traditional non-bypass movement, starter kit type movement. Let's see, they have a couple options here. They could go 1, 2, 3, 4. But as soon as they move into this hex, they would be susceptible to fire from these units here. These guys could fire on them, and these guys could fire on them. Okay, well, what if I went this way? If I went the other way? Or what if I went through the woods? What if I went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Well, I'd have to double time then. Plus, in this hex, the medium machine gun squad and leader up here could light me up down here, assuming they hadn't fired on anything else, right? Assuming they hadn't made this any shot at this squad that had moved, and they could still fire. They could fire right into there. That would be an 8 -1 shot. So it would be -1 non-assault movement, -1 leader, +1 woods for a -1 total. Not something I would like to do if I went this way and double time to get there. Now, even worse would be if I tried to go like that. They might have a line. Yeah, they'd have a, no, that would be blocked there. But they could still fire on me here, and they could take a snapshot as I cross that hex side as well. It'd be an area fire, but it would still be, in this case, it'd be a 4 -3. I don't like that either at all. So let's see, that would be 1, 2, 3, and I'd have to double time. So I either have to double time, get fired on by these guys, double time this way, take a 4 -3 snapshot as I cross through this hex side here, or go through these woods and take an 8 -1 shot as I traverse the woods, assuming all these units could still fire. And I would get there in any of those situations I don't like. I'd get there counter exhausted, which is what I don't want. Now let's do it with bypass. Well, the bypass, I could go, there's really only one option you would choose here. You would go 1, bypass along that side for 2, 3, 4. So 1, 2, 4. And you'd be in your objective hex. You would still take fire from this unit, possible fire from this unit if you could fire, but it would be a, let's see, 8 -1 for non-assault movement, -1 +2 building. It'd be an 8 even shot. but you would not be counter exhausted. And no units could fire at you as you bypassed this hex side because none of them have line of sights to these two vertices. Nor could they fire into the center hex and cross through the hex side that you traversed because this hedge blocks their line of sight. So with those three examples, they're pretty simplistic examples. Shows you how just the simple mechanic of bypass can change the way you approach objectives, can change the way you make your movement decisions, and it can change the way that your defenders decide to fire at you. Okay. There's one other thing I forgot to mention on the mechanics of bypass. In order for you to bypass a hex, there must be a clear gap between the woods or building obstacle image depiction and the hex site itself. I checked earlier on this and there are no cases where that happens, but there's a couple that are very close. If you look here, that you could barely bypass that with infantry. It's almost touching. And here. Hedges and walls are extensions of hex sides where they exist, so you have to have a gap between the woods depiction in this case and the depiction of the hedge also in this case. And here you could barely bypass this side. If there's no gap, and there are cases where that happens, well, it happens in anything that has a solid like this as well, but anywhere where there's a depiction where it's just touching but not over, you cannot bypass that hex side. So I think that's it. Hopefully I showed you at a high level what bypass mechanics look like, how they work, and how you can use them to change the dynamics of your tactics on the battlefield and your decision making on how you move your units to get to objectives or on your way to objectives to either avoid defensive fire or change the odds ratios or the modifiers to defensive fire die rolls against you as you move. I love bypass because it makes the game feel totally different when I'm doing movement and fire, defensive fire. Like I said, I wish it was in starter kit because it's not that complex. Just like I wish sniper activation was in starter kit, but it's not. So I guess you have to move to full ASL. So you starter kit players, this is what you have to look forward to with bypass. I love it, and I hope this was informative. Let me do my die roll. What should I do? I use we have Russians. I don't have Russians. Yeah, I do right here. Let's see if the Rusky die roll give me 5. Not bad. I get rate of fire on this medium with that. All right, that's it. I'll see you next time for exercise 5, where I'm going to go into more detail on line of sight. I just touched on line of sight a little bit here, but I'm going to go into it in a deeper level, talk about line of sight, hindrances, and how they affect fire and firepower. Until then, roll lower than a 5.